Boston, 1842. Elizabeth Hadley still wore the ring, not out of love, not out of mourning, but because taking it off would mean admitting Jonathan was dead, and admitting that meant feeling relief. And decent women were not supposed to feel relief when their husbands died. She turned the gold band around her finger as she sat by the parlor window, watching snow fall over Beacon Hill. The house was too large for one person, too silent. But silence was better than his voice. "You're useless, Elizabeth. Can't even give me an heir." 6 months. 6 months since Jonathan's heart had failed him in the middle of one of his rages, shouting at a footman, face red, veins bulging. 6 months since she had stood in the hallway, watching his body being carried away, and felt nothing, or perhaps fear, because the dead did not shout, but ghosts still could. She pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fireplace was lit, but the cold lived inside her. It always had. Outside, a carriage stopped at the gate. Elizabeth froze. No one came here, no one knocked on her door. Jonathan had made sure of that, driving away neighbors, dismissing the few acquaintances she had, isolating her as if she were an infection. But now someone stepped out of the carriage, a tall man, dark coat, straight posture, and he looked directly toward the window where she stood. Elizabeth stepped back, heart racing, hands trembling. The ring burned against her skin. Who was that man? Lady Elizabeth Byrne had been sold at 19. Not with chains, not on an auction block, but sold all the same, by a father drowning in debt who chose to save his title instead of his daughter. Jonathan Hadley had offered £10,000 and the promise to take her far away. The Baron accepted without hesitation. "You ought to thank me," her father had said on the morning of the wedding. "He's rich. You'll never go hungry." Hunger of the body? No. Hunger of the soul. Always. Jonathan brought her to Boston the way a man transports a valuable object, something to display, control, and keep away from other eyes. For the first few months, he pretended gentleness. Then, when she failed to conceive, the mask fell away. And for 9 long years, Elizabeth learned how to disappear inside her own home, to walk in silence, to never ask, to never exist. Now he was dead, but the rules he taught her were still alive. She still did not leave the house alone, still asked the servants for permission to open a window, still woke at night expecting to hear his heavy footsteps in the corridor. And now someone had knocked on her door. Elizabeth heard the deep voice of the butler in the entrance hall, heard the reply, an English male voice, steady and composed. "The Duke of Somerton. I've come regarding matters of the late Mr. Hadley's estate." A duke. Elizabeth clenched her fists. Another man, another title. Another voice that would demand, decide, take. She did not go downstairs. She remained by the window, holding her breath, praying he would leave. But downstairs, the door opened, and for the first time in 6 months, someone walked into the house that had been her prison. Chapter 1. The Man on the Threshold. Elizabeth descended the stairs the way one walks toward a sentence. Each step carried an old echo. "Don't come down until I call. Don't speak unless I ask. Don't look any man in the eyes." Jonathan's rules clung to the walls like mildew, soaked into the wallpaper, whispering through the polished wood. She reached the last step and stopped, hands pressed against the black folds of her morning gown. Black, always black. She had worn it for 6 months, but it felt as though she'd been wrapped in darkness for a lifetime. The butler, Mr. Peters, waited by the library door, his face unreadable. Jonathan had hired him. Jonathan had hired everyone. No one in the house belonged to her. "Milady," Peters murmured, "the Duke of Somerton insists on speaking with you. He says it is a legal matter." Legal. Contracts, property. Things men decided while women signed wherever they were told to. Elizabeth nodded silently, and Peters opened the door. The library smelled of old leather and ink. Jonathan had spent hours locked in here, drinking, muttering over ledgers, slamming drawers. She had never entered without permission. Even now, with him gone, crossing the threshold felt like trespass. But the man standing by the fireplace did not belong to that place of shadows. He was tall, taller than Jonathan had been, broad-shouldered beneath a dark travel coat, brown hair slightly tousled as though he'd ridden for hours without rest. And when he turned, his eyes, blue, clear, startlingly perceptive, met hers with something she had not seen in years. Not possession, not contempt, surprise. "Lady Hadley," he said, and his voice was different, not sharp, not impatient, simply human. "I apologize for the intrusion. I'm David Carrington, Duke of Somerton." He bowed, a real bow, brief and informal, but genuine. Elizabeth froze. She did not know how to respond. Jonathan had never bowed to her. No one had. Your Grace," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. She barely spoke. There had been no one to speak to. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I imagine not," he replied, and there was a gentle note beneath the words. He stepped forward, then stopped, noticing her retreat. "I came from England to settle matters regarding my cousin, Lord Geoffrey Carrington. He had a business partnership with your late husband." Geoffrey. She vaguely remembered the name. Jonathan had mentioned a partnership once, years ago. She had never been included, never informed. I don't know anything about my husband's business," she admitted. The Duke tilted his head, studying her carefully. Not coldly, thoughtfully. "You don't?" he said quietly. "Then who is overseeing the estate now?" A tightness pressed beneath her ribs. No one. Lawyers came, left documents, told her where to sign. She signed. She didn't ask. She never understood. "The lawyers," she murmured. Carrington frowned, not in anger but in concern. "The lawyers manage everything?" She nodded, gaze dropping to the floor. Small, ignorant, exactly what Jonathan had drilled into her. Silence settled before he asked, softer than before. "Lady Hadley, are you well?" The question struck her like a blow. No one had asked her that. Not once, not in a very long time. Elizabeth lifted her eyes and found him closer now, not threatening, but close enough for her to see sincerity in his expression. Her voice trembled. She stepped back until her shoulders touched the bookshelf. The ring burned on her finger. "I'm fine. I simply don't usually receive callers." David Carrington studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, as one might approach a frightened creature, he spoke. "I see." And something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not mockingly, not dismissively, warmly. "Well," he said, stepping back to give her space, "I promise I don't bite. And if you prefer I return another day, I will. But there are documents requiring your signature, and I believe you have the right to know exactly what you're signing." "Right. Since when did she have rights?" He waited, patiently, as if she might refuse him, as if she had a choice. And for the first time in a long, long while, Elizabeth Hadley felt something other than fear. She felt curiosity. Chapter 2. Broken Things. David Carrington had seen fear before, in India during the famine, in Egypt, in villages torn apart by raiders, in Whitechapel, where misery ground people down to dust, but he had never seen fear like this, not inside a woman's own home. She stood pressed against the bookshelf as if he might drag her away by force. Her eyes, large, brown, shimmering with something he could not yet name, barely blinked. Her hands, pale and small, clutched the black folds of her morning dress so tightly her knuckles had gone white. And that ring. David had noticed it at once, a simple band of gold, a wedding ring. She kept twisting it without realizing, like someone holding on to the last scrap of solid ground before sinking. He stepped back another pace, softening his voice. "I didn't come to cause trouble, Lady Hadley, only to sort out legal matters. My cousin Geoffrey left several contracts unresolved, and your name appears on many of them." She didn't speak, only gave a small, quick nod, obedient, reflexive, trained. Something tightened in David's chest. He had dealt with arrogant aristocrats, dishonest merchants, widows who knew how to manipulate every room they entered. But this woman was none of those. She was shattered. And he had always hated shattered things. Since boyhood, he had tried to fix whatever he found broken. Birds with torn wings, abandoned dogs, forgotten people. A ridiculous habit, Geoffrey used to tease him. "You can't save everyone, David." No, but he could damn well try. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the writing desk buried under dusty ledgers. "I just need to review a few documents. I won't take much of your time." She hesitated. Then, in a hoarse whisper, "Your Grace may do whatever you need." The words were wrong. Too submissive, too automatic. David frowned but said nothing. He crossed the room and began sorting the papers, searching for the contracts Geoffrey had mentioned. The library smelled of old leather and something else. Stale fear, perhaps, or long-held loneliness. He read quietly, but part of his attention never left her. Lady Hadley still hadn't moved. She remained by the bookshelf, rigid, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Her eyes drifted to the window, to the snow falling outside, as if wishing to be anywhere but here. David finally found the main contract. He read it, then froze. "Good God!" Her voice came instantly taut. "Is something wrong?" He lifted his head. She was even paler than before, if that were possible. "Not wrong," he said slowly. "But did you know you are co-owner of 3 warehouses in the Boston harbor?" She blinked. "I know. And that you hold shares in 2 shipping routes to London." Silence. David dropped the contract onto the desk. "Lady Hadley," he said, keeping his voice even though irritation surged beneath it. Irritation not at her, but at the vultures circling her. "You legally own half of this estate. Your husband structured the contract so that, in the event of his death, the assets passed to his direct heir. He had no children. That heir should be you." She stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. "But the lawyers said I should sign—" "Sign what?" She swallowed hard. "Transfers, documents. They said it was necessary." David's jaw tightened. Of course. Lawyers. Men who saw widows as easy prey. He knew the type well. "Do you still have the papers they asked you to sign?" She nodded wordlessly, walking slowly, as though each step might crack beneath her, to a side drawer. She withdrew a bundle of papers tied with ribbon. David took them, scanned them, and felt cold fury ignite. Property transfers, sale of shares, renunciations of rights, all signed by her. All benefiting someone else, Jonathan's associates, undoubtedly, who were stripping her of everything while she didn't understand what she was signing. He dropped the stack harder than he intended. "These men are robbing you." Elizabeth flinched at the sharpness in his voice. He drew a breath, forcing calm. "I'm not angry at you," he said gently. "I'm angry at them." She didn't answer, but her expression shifted, not to confidence, not yet, but to something faintly alive, a flicker of awareness. "What does your Grace suggest I do?" David folded his arms, thinking. There were ways to undo this, appeals, challenges, but it would take time, lawyers, and she clearly trusted no one, with good reason. He studied her, really studied her. She was beautiful, in a quiet, fragile way. A thin face, wide haunted eyes, a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. The black dress weighed on her like a shroud. A widow, alone, exploited. Geoffrey would have said, "This isn't your problem, David. Sign the papers and go home." But David had never been good at walking away from someone left in ruins. "I suggest," he said slowly, "that you stop signing anything until I review it first." She blinked. "Yes, and it would help me." He gave a lopsided, irreverent smile, the kind that irritated half the London aristocracy. "Well, since I'm here, and since your finances are technically tangled up with my late cousin's, let's say I have a personal interest in ensuring no one cheats you." She was quiet for a long time, then barely audible. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Because he hated injustice. Because she looked like a bird whose wings had been clipped. Because no one should live this terrified inside their own home. But what he said was simply, "Because it's the right thing to do." And for the first time since he entered that heavy, suffocating library, David saw something in her eyes other than fear. He saw hope, fragile, trembling, but hope nonetheless. Chapter 3. Small Freedoms. David Carrington returned the next morning. Elizabeth hadn't expected that. Men like him, dukes, lords, men of consequence, didn't return. They handled what needed to be handled, issued instructions and moved on, leaving others to obey in their wake. But at 10 o'clock sharp, the bell rang. And there he was. No heavy travelling coat this time. He wore a dark blue wool waistcoat over a crisp white shirt, the sleeves lightly rolled as if he'd come straight from real work, rather than aristocratic duties. His hair was slightly mussed again, and he smiled, not at her but at the butler, as though Peters were an old acquaintance. "Good morning, Mr. Peters. Is the mistress available?" Mistress, not Lady Hadley, not the widow. Mistress, as if she had authority, as if the house belonged to her. Peters glanced up the staircase, startled. Elizabeth stood there, hands clenched in her skirts. She wore the same black dress as yesterday. She had others, all black, but this one hid her best. Hid everything. "Your Grace," she murmured when she reached the bottom step. "I didn't expect that I'd return," he grinned as though deeply amused. "Well, I brought something I thought you might like to see." He lifted a leather portfolio. "Documents?" Her stomach knotted. More papers, more words she wouldn't understand, more blind signatures, but he shook his head. "Not exactly, may I?" He gestured toward the library. She nodded wordlessly and followed. David spread the papers across the desk with the careless confidence of a man unafraid of clutter. Elizabeth remained near the doorway observing. He didn't move like Jonathan. Jonathan was rigid, every gesture precise and meant to intimidate. David moved, freely, as if nothing in the world frightened him. "Here," he said, pointing to a set of pages. "These are the original contracts your husband signed with my cousin Geoffrey, and these," he tapped another pile, "are the documents the lawyers asked you to sign." Elizabeth stepped closer, cautiously. "See the difference?" He pointed at a clause. "In the originals, you're listed as co-owner. Here, in the new papers, your name is gone. Everything is being transferred to a Mr. Whitfield. Do you know him?" She frowned. "He was one of Jonathan's business partners." "Was," David repeated dryly. "And now he's trying to steal your share." Steal. The word hit like a blow, harsh, but undeniably true. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," he said gently. There was no accusation in his voice, and only understanding. They counted on that. He leaned back, arms crossed, studying her. "Lady Hadley, may I ask something?" She nodded, tense. "Why did you sign without reading?" The question should have sounded like a reprimand, but it didn't. It sounded like genuine curiosity. Elizabeth lowered her gaze. "Because that's what I always did. Jonathan never explained anything. He just told me where to sign, and I signed." Silence settled between them. Then his voice came softer. "And if he had told you to sign your own death warrant?" She gasped at the bluntness. David wasn't smiling, but he wasn't being cruel either. Just honest. "I'm not judging," he said. "I'm trying to understand. Because I need to know this. Do you want to understand these documents, or do you prefer that I simply take care of everything and tell you what to do?" The question hit harder than anything else. No one had ever asked her what she wanted, not once. I don't know," she whispered. He tilted his head. "You don't know if you want to learn, or you don't know if you're capable?" Her eyes stung. She blinked quickly. "I don't know if it matters," she murmured. "Even if I understand, I'm still just a woman. Men will still make the decisions." He was silent for several long seconds. Then, slowly, David stood and walked toward her, not fast, not looming, but with quiet purpose, stopping a respectful distance away. "Lady Hadley," he said, voice steady, "you control a considerable fortune, property, shares, influence. And yes, the law has its limits, but that does not make you powerless. She held her breath. "What it means," he continued, "is that you need allies, not masters. Allies, people who explain, not command. And if you'll have me, I can be one of them." Ally. The word felt dangerous, strange. Men were never allies to women like her. They were owners, judges, punishments. But he waited, patient, as though her answer truly mattered. Elizabeth looked at the papers on the desk, numbers, clauses, words that had always been a foreign language. "Could you explain?" she whispered. "Not just tell me what to do, but teach me?" David's smile was soft, not triumphant, but approving. "With pleasure." They spent the entire morning in the library. David went through each clause slowly, translating the legal jargon into simple language. At first, Elizabeth merely listened, quiet and tense, but then she began to ask small, timid questions. "And this? What does irrevocable transfer mean?" "It means once you sign, you can't undo it. It's permanent." "I signed something permanent without knowing?" "Yes, but we can challenge it. There are legal precedents for overturning contracts signed under coercion or misinformation." She blinked. "Coercion?" He met her eyes solemnly. "Were you ever told you had a choice?" She said nothing, because the answer was obvious. "No," he concluded gently. "Then it was coercion." At noon, Peters knocked to announce lunch. David stretched his shoulders. "Well, I suppose I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Elizabeth hesitated, sitting comfortably for the first time in years. Will you return?" He looked surprised. Then warm amusement lit his face. "If you'll allow it." She nodded too quickly and felt her cheeks heat. He walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, sir, one more thing, Lady Hadley." "Yes?" "Stop calling me Your Grace. It's insufferable. David will do." Her eyes widened. I can't." "You can," he said with a wink. "I give permission." And before she could argue, he stepped out, whistling a cheerful tune wildly inappropriate for a house in mourning. Elizabeth remained in the center of the library, heart pounding. And for the first time in years, she smiled. Only a little, barely visible. But she smiled. Chapter 4. The Man Who Sees Too Much. David returned to the hotel with more questions than answers. The Parker House was the finest establishment in Boston, luxurious, noisy, full of American merchants who talked too loudly and laughed even louder. Normally he found the chaos refreshing, far more honest than the stiff, polished world of London's aristocracy. But today the noise grated on him. He went straight to his room, tossed his coat over a chair, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He drank slowly, watching the snow drift across the city through the tall window. Lady Hadley, Elizabeth, he couldn't get her out of his mind. It wasn't attraction, at least, not only that. It was something more unsettling, something sharper, like watching someone drown in shallow water and not understanding why they didn't simply stand. But he knew why, because she had been taught to drown. David took another sip, his jaw tightening. He had seen bad marriages. God knew the English aristocracy excelled at turning unions into silent battlegrounds, but this was different. Jonathan Hadley hadn't just controlled Elizabeth, he had erased her, and worst of all, she believed she deserved it. David set the glass down and crossed to the desk. He opened the leather folder he'd brought back and reviewed the contracts again. Whitfield. The man's name appeared in 5 different documents, Jonathan's business partner, and the primary beneficiary of 3 transfers Elizabeth had signed in recent months. David had met men like him before, widow predators. They lurked around grief the way vultures circled dying animals, arriving with sympathetic smiles and necessary papers, walking away wealthier while the widow was left with nothing. He knew the type, and despised every one of them, but something else in the papers bothered him. The dates. The first 3 transfers had been signed 1 week after Jonathan's death. 1 week, barely enough time to bury the man, and the vultures were already carving up what remained. David closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "Control yourself, Carrington." He could almost hear Geoffrey's voice. "You get involved too easily, David. You can't save everyone, especially people who don't want to be saved. But Elizabeth did want to be saved. He had seen it in her eyes, quiet hunger not for rescue but for understanding, for autonomy, for the chance to exist. She just didn't know how. The next morning, David didn't go to her house. He went to the law office handling Jonathan Hadley's estate. The building smelled of fresh ink and ambition, polished wood, expensive paintings, and a secretary who looked at him with thinly veiled suspicion until David mentioned his title. Duke of Somerton. I'm here regarding the estate of Mr. Jonathan Hadley. The secretary's attitude changed instantly. Bows, oily smiles, obsequiousness. Of course, Your Grace. Mr. Whitfield will see you shortly. Whitfield. Perfect. David waited in the conference room, looking out over the city. Boston was strange, half English, half American, always caught between what it had been and what it wanted to become. Like Elizabeth. The door opened. A man entered, mid-50s, thick around the middle, face flushed from drink. Expensive suit. Signet ring. A smile that never reached his eyes. Your Grace, an honor. Thomas Whitfield at your service. He extended his hand. David shook it, testing his grip. Whitfield squeezed harder, trying to impress, but without strength. Weak. Mr. Whitfield, David said, I've come from England to resolve matters concerning the inheritance of my cousin, Geoffrey Carrington. He was in partnership with the late Mr. Hadley. Whitfield nodded, sitting with exaggerated ease. Yes, yes. Tragic loss. Geoffrey was a brilliant businessman. Was. David kept his voice flat. He left several unresolved contracts. I'd like to review them. Certainly, everything is in order, but I should mention most of Mr. Hadley's business affairs were transferred legally after his death. The widow signed all necessary documents. David tilted his head. She signed. But did she understand what she was signing? Whitfield blinked. I pardon? Did Lady Hadley understand the documents you placed before her? Silence, then a nervous chuckle. Well, Your Grace, she's a woman. Financial matters are not precisely her area of expertise. David smiled, not pleasantly. Interesting. Because she is legally the co-owner of half of Jonathan Hadley's fortune, which means financial matters are her area of expertise, by right. Whitfield stiffened. Technically, yes. But you chose not to explain. David's voice sharpened. You relied on her ignorance. You made her sign transfers that benefited you personally. Whitfield's face turned a deeper shade of red. Your Grace, that is an outrageous accusation. Everything was done within the law. Within the letter of the law, David corrected coolly, not its spirit and certainly not its ethics. Whitfield rose, fists clenched. I don't know what the widow has told you, but she told me nothing, David interrupted, standing as well, taller, younger, far more dangerous, and he wanted Whitfield to feel that. She didn't need to. The contracts speak for themselves, and I am here to inform you that from now on Lady Hadley will sign nothing without my review. Whitfield sputtered. You have no authority. I do, David said softly, because she gave it to me. And if you attempt to pressure her, manipulate her, or even suggest she sign anything without my presence, I will personally see to it that every document you touched in the last 6 months is dragged into court. And believe me, Mr. Whitfield, dukes have very, very good lawyers. Whitfield went pale. This is preposterous. David leaned in, voice low and lethal. This is justice, and if you have any sense, you'll accept it. Because the alternative is me dismantling every transaction you've made. When I'm done, you won't simply lose the money, you'll lose your reputation. He stepped back, adjusting his waistcoat with calm finality. Good day, Mr. Whitfield. I'm sure we'll see each other again. And he walked out, leaving the man speechless. Outside, David took a long breath. Snow was falling again, soft and quiet, blanketing the city in white. He should have felt satisfied. He'd issued the warning. He'd protected Elizabeth. He'd fulfilled his duty. But something still bothered him. Why do you care so much? Geoffrey's voice again. Because injustice infuriated him, yes. Because she was vulnerable, yes. But there was something else. He remembered the way she had looked at him yesterday when he explained the contracts, those large brown eyes filled with quiet hunger, not for affection, but for understanding, for possibility, for a life she had never been allowed to imagine. And David, damn him, couldn't look away. He shoved his hands into his pockets and began walking, back toward Beacon Hill, back toward her, because whether he wanted it or not, Elizabeth Hadley had become his responsibility, and David Carrington never abandoned his responsibilities, even when he should. Chapter 5. The first question. Elizabeth woke before dawn, not from a nightmare, not from fear, but because for the first time in years she had something to look forward to. He was coming back today. He had said he would. David. She still couldn't bring herself to think of him that way, not aloud, not even in the privacy of her own mind. Dukes were not David. They were your grace, your lordship, distant men who lived in worlds far above hers. But he had asked, "Stop calling me your grace, it's irritating." Elizabeth sat up, pulling the wool shawl around her shoulders. The house was cold, it always was. Jonathan had never allowed too many fires to be lit. Coal costs money, and you do nothing to deserve it. But yesterday David had instructed Peters to light every fireplace in the house. "It's far too cold in here," he'd said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if she deserved warmth. She rose and walked to the window. Snow blanketed Beacon Hill, white, clean, still, beautiful. She used to hate snow. Jonathan hated it, therefore she was supposed to hate it too. But today, the snow looked different. At 8 she went down for breakfast. Peters was in the hall adjusting the candlesticks, and he looked genuinely startled to see her. "Milady, good morning." "Good morning, Peters." She almost never spoke to him. She almost never spoke to anyone. But today the words came easier. He hesitated. "Milady, the Duke of Somerton sent a message. He said he will call at 11 o'clock, if it is convenient." If it is convenient, as though her convenience mattered. Elizabeth nodded, something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Lightness, perhaps. "Tell him he will be welcome." Peters allowed himself a small, discreet smile. "Yes, milady." She spent the morning in the library, rereading the documents David had explained the day before. Numbers, clauses, words that finally meant something. Irrevocable transfer, renunciation of rights, co-proprietor. She was a co-proprietor. She owned property, money, power, and she had never known. Jonathan had ensured that, kept her ignorant dependent silent, and when he died, other men, Whitfield, the lawyers, simply continued the work. Women were not meant to know, only to sign. Elizabeth closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the wedding band. "Take it off," a voice whispered deep inside her. "Take it off and be done with it." But she couldn't. Not yet. At exactly 11, the bell rang. Elizabeth stood too fast, smoothed her black skirt, drew in a breath. Control. Composure. But when Peters opened the door and David stepped inside, smiling, slightly rumpled, bringing cold air and life into the house, she forgot how to breathe. "Good morning, Lady Hadley." Good morning." He handed his coat to Peters, then looked at her. "Did you sleep well?" No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever cared. Yes. Thank you." He smiled again, that curious, half-amused smile that made it seem as though he saw something others didn't. "Good. We have work to do." They returned to the library. David spread new papers across the desk, contracts, letters, records. "I visited Whitfield's office yesterday," he said, too casually. Elizabeth's breath caught. "You visited?" "Yes, and we had a very enlightening conversation." His tone shifted, calm but edged with steel. "He won't trouble you again. I made sure of it." She didn't know how to respond. Part of her felt relief, another part, fear. He was angry? David tilted his head. "He was, but that doesn't matter. He could Retaliate. No, the word was firm, final. Not while I'm here. Elizabeth looked at him, truly looked, at the face without masks, at the blue eyes that hid no agenda. While I'm here. But he wouldn't stay forever. Dukes did not stay. They had estates, responsibilities, entire worlds elsewhere. And when he left, For how long will you remain in Boston? David paused, then answered slowly, Long enough. Long enough for what? He smiled, but softer this time, almost sad. To make sure you're safe. Safe. The word felt foreign, impossible. I have never been safe. The confession escaped before she realized. Horrified, she covered her mouth. I'm sorry, I shouldn't... Why? David did not move. He only waited. Why shouldn't you speak the truth? Her hand dropped, trembling. Because it's improper. To complain. To speak ill of the dead. To sound weak. He watched her hands twisting in her lap, hands conditioned to expect punishment for the smallest honesty. How long were you married to your husband? He asked quietly. Elizabeth drew a slow, heavy breath. 9 years. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart falter. Weak. He leaned forward, forearms on the desk, gaze unwavering. Lady Hadley. Elizabeth. You survived 9 years beside a tyrant. That is not weakness. That is endurance. Her eyes burned. It doesn't feel like strength. That's because no one ever told you that it was. Silence, deep, raw, unfiltered, filled the room. Then David leaned back, exhaling. May I ask you something else? She nodded. Was he always like that? Elizabeth closed her eyes. No. At first, he pretended. Kindness. Attention. But after the wedding, she swallowed hard. When it became clear I wouldn't conceive, everything changed. David's jaw tightened. I blamed you. It wasn't a question. Yes. Her voice barely held. He said I was defective, useless, that the only reason he'd married me was to secure an heir. And I couldn't even do that. Rage flickered across David's face, sharp, righteous, but he didn't lash out. He inhaled deeply, mastering himself. And your father? His voice dropped. Did he know? Elizabeth let out a broken, bitter laugh. My father sold me, David. She didn't notice she had used his name, but he did. And something shifted in his eyes, something dangerous, something protective. Sold, he repeated slowly. Yes, he was drowning in debt. Jonathan offered £10,000, and my father accepted without hesitation. She glanced down at the ring. He said I should be grateful, that it was fortunate Jonathan wanted me as a wife. David closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. When he opened them, the softness was gone, replaced by something fierce. Listen to me, Elizabeth. He rose, walked to her and stopped a single step away. Your father was wrong. Jonathan was wrong. And every man who ever made you believe you were less than you are was wrong. She looked up, unable to speak. You are not defective. You are not useless. You are not weak. He hesitated, then offered his hand. And if I can help you believe that, then I'll have done something worthwhile. Elizabeth stared at his hand. Men did not offer hands. They demanded obedience. They took. But David waited, patient, gentle. Slowly, trembling, she placed her hand in his, and when his fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, certain, something inside her cracked open. Not from pain, from relief. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding hands, just existing. Then he stepped back, releasing her with deliberate care. Well, he said lightly, as if breaking a spell, enough melancholy for today. We have contracts to demolish. Elizabeth blinked, then let out the tiniest surprised laugh. David grinned. Ah, so you can laugh. Her cheeks warmed. I forgot how. Then, he said with a wink, I'll simply have to remind you. And as he returned to the desk, whistling that infuriatingly cheerful tune again, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt in years. Strength. Fragile. Frightened. But alive. Chapter 6. The Man Who Shouldn't Stay. David knew he had been staying far too long. It had been a full week since he arrived in Boston. A week reviewing contracts, confronting lawyers, spending long mornings in Elizabeth's library while snow fell quietly outside. A week watching her change. Small things at first. She no longer stepped back when he entered a room. No longer held her breath when he came near. Yesterday she had asked a question about compound interest without a single stutter. And today, for the first time, she had called him by his name. David. He shouldn't enjoy hearing it as much as he did. But he did, and that was a problem. He returned to the hotel at dusk, tired and unsettled. He climbed the stairs to his room, ordered dinner, and stared at the fire burning low in the grate. He should be planning his return to England. Geoffrey was dead, the contracts were sorted, and Elizabeth was better. She didn't need him anymore. So why was he still here? Because you're a fool, Geoffrey's voice said in his mind. Because you see a wounded bird and cannot bring yourself to walk away. David drank his whiskey slowly, annoyed with himself. It wasn't only that. It wasn't just the instinct to protect. It was her. The way Elizabeth listened when he explained something, attentive, hungry for understanding, as if every word were water in a desert. The way she touched the documents now, carefully but without fear. The way she had laughed yesterday at a ridiculous joke he made about lawyers. She was coming back to life, and he wanted to witness it, wanted to be there the moment she finally realized she was free. But staying was dangerous. David knew himself. He had the terrible habit of becoming attached to lost causes. And Elizabeth wasn't a cause. She was a person, a woman. A widow still dressed in mourning, still twisting her wedding ring when she grew anxious. A woman not ready for anything beyond safety. And he had no right to want more. The next morning David woke with his decision made. One more week. He would finish organizing the contracts, ensure Elizabeth had trustworthy counsel, and then return to England. Simple, logical, appropriate. But when he arrived at the Beacon Hill house at 11 o'clock, and Peters led him to the library, and Elizabeth turned from the window with a shy smile, the first true smile he had ever seen from her, every logical thought dissolved. "Good morning, David." She said his name naturally, without hesitation, and something in his chest tightened. "Good morning." He removed his coat, trying to sound casual. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes." She hesitated, then added softly, "I dreamed of gardens." David raised an eyebrow. "Gardens?" A faint flush warmed her cheeks. "I used to love gardens. Before. At my father's estate in Hampshire there was one. I spent hours there. And here?" He nodded toward the window, where the small yard lay buried under snow. "There's no garden?" Her gaze dropped. Jonathan didn't like them. He said they were a waste of time and money. Of course he did, David thought darkly, because he was a controlling bastard. But what he said aloud was, "Then make one." She blinked, startled. What? "Make a garden. You own this house now. You may do whatever you like." She stared at him as if he had suggested she command the tides. I can't simply—" "You can." He crossed his arms, smiling. "Who would stop you? Jonathan is dead. Whitfield is terrified to come near you, and I think gardens are an excellent idea." Silence stretched between them, but her eyes were shining, not with tears, with something far more dangerous, possibility. "A garden," she repeated, testing the word. "In the spring?" "In the spring," he confirmed. "And if you want, I'll help plan it. I know nothing about flowers, but I can pull stones and dig holes." She laughed, softly, unexpectedly, as though the sound surprised her, and David, curse him, felt like a conqueror hearing his first victory hymn, over a laugh, over her. They spent the morning reviewing more contracts. David explained port fees, tea imports, and how Elizabeth could renegotiate the terms to regain full control. She absorbed everything, asked questions, took notes with steady hands, and at some point, David realized he wasn't reading the papers anymore. He was watching her, watching the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The wedding ring she still wore, though she now twisted it less. Stop it, he warned himself, but he couldn't. At noon, Peters brought tea. Elizabeth served, an old habit drilled into her for years, but when she handed David his cup, their fingers brushed. It was brief, accidental, but she froze, and so did he. He saw the flush bloom along her throat, saw the way she pulled back too quickly, nearly spilling the tea. "Forgive me," she murmured, eyes downcast. "There's nothing to forgive." He steadied the cup, keeping his voice calm. "It was an accident." "I know, but—" She bit her lip again. But what?" She lifted her eyes, fragile and honest. "Jonathan didn't like when I touched him. Not even by accident." The fury that surged through David was sharp and cold enough to break bone. "Jonathan Hadley," he thought. "If you weren't dead already, I'd kill you myself." But he forced his voice to remain gentle. "Jonathan was a fool." Her eyes widened, scandalized. "David." "He was," David insisted. "And everything he told you, every lie he made you believe about yourself, all of it was wrong." She went still, breathing too fast. He set the cup aside and leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "Elizabeth, you don't bother me. Your touch doesn't bother me. Your presence doesn't bother me. In fact—" He hesitated, knowing he was stepping onto dangerous ground. "In fact, being here with you is the best part of my day." A stillness fell, deep and absolute. Then, in a voice barely louder than the snow outside, she whispered, "Why?" David gave her a sad, honest smile. "Because you're brave, and you haven't realized it yet." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "I'm not brave. I'm afraid of everything." "Being afraid doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human." He held her gaze. "Courage is being afraid and moving forward anyway. And you've been doing that every single day." A tear slipped down her cheek. David wanted to wipe it away, but he didn't. Not yet. She still feared touch, still wasn't ready. But she did not look away, and for now, that was enough. When David left that afternoon, snow was falling again, thick and silent across Boston. He walked slowly toward the hotel, hands in his pockets, thoughts tangled. "One more week," he reminded himself. "Then you leave." But for the first time since arriving in Boston, he wasn't sure he could. Because Elizabeth Hadley was no longer just a widow who needed protection. She was becoming someone extraordinary. And David, damn him, wanted to know who she would become once she was finally free. Even if it meant breaking the only rule he had ever lived by: never fall in love with the person you're trying to save. Chapter 7. The Kiss. Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about him. Not in a romantic way, at least not in any way she would dare admit aloud, but David slipped into every thought, every quiet corner of her mind. The way he explained things, the way he laughed, the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with desire, but with respect. As if she were someone worthy of being seen, and that frightened her as much as it warmed her. It had been 10 days since his arrival, 10 days of mornings spent in the library, of contracts unknotted, of conversations that started with business and wandered into everything else. He had told her about India, about golden temples and crowded markets, about Geoffrey, the cousin who died too soon, pragmatic and cold, but loyal in his own way. She had told him about Hampshire, about the rose garden, about the mother who died when she was 12, about the father who never forgave her for being born a daughter instead of a son, and somewhere between words and silences, something had shifted. She didn't know its name, but she felt it. That morning, David arrived earlier than usual. At 9, the bell rang, and there he was, snow tangled in his hair, a smile on his face, and something wrapped in brown paper tucked beneath his arm. "Good morning, Elizabeth." She didn't correct him anymore. Didn't ask him to call her Lady Hadley because being Elizabeth felt right. "Good morning, what is that?" He handed her the package, eyes bright with a quiet sort of pride. "Open it." She hesitated, then untied the string. Inside was a book. Green leather, cream-colored pages, the faint smell of fresh ink. The title gleamed in gold, The Cultivation of Roses in New England. She looked up, stunned. "David." "For the garden," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets as if he hadn't spent hours searching for it. "Thought it might help when spring comes." Elizabeth pressed the book to her chest, something tight and aching rising in her throat. No one had ever given her gifts. Jonathan had bought jewelry, necklaces and earrings, but they were symbols of possession. Wear this to dinner. Show them you belong to me. But this was different. David had given her something she wanted, something that recognized who she was. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." He grinned. "Just promise you'll plant roses, and let me dig the holes." She laughed, and this time the sound came easier. "I promise." They spent the morning reading together. David sat beside her on the library sofa, not too close, but close enough that she felt the warmth of him, and they flipped through the book, discussing rose varieties, planting seasons, the stubbornness of New England soil. Elizabeth couldn't remember the last time she'd felt light. No fear, no rules, just her, David, and the possibility of a garden. "This one," she said softly, pointing to an illustration. "Damask rose. My mother loved them." David leaned in, studying the page. "They're beautiful, and I imagine they smell wonderful. Yes, the scent is unforgettable." She traced the drawing with her fingertip. "My mother used to say roses were like people, some delicate, some resilient, but all of them in need of care." David was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "She taught me to love beautiful things. My father taught me to fear them. And Jonathan?" The question was gentle, but it carried weight. "Jonathan taught me I didn't deserve anything." David turned fully toward her. "And do you believe him?" She hesitated. A week ago she would have said yes. A week ago she would have lowered her eyes and whispered apologies. But now, no. The word came firm, steady. "Not anymore." David's smile wasn't triumphant. It was something much deeper. Pride, maybe. "Well," he said softly, "that is the most beautiful thing you've ever said to me." Her heart stumbled in her chest. They were too close. Close enough for her to see the faint lines around his eyes, the thin scar on his brow, the way he looked at her as if she were precious. "Pull away," Jonathan's voice hissed in her memory. "You have no right to want anything. You are a widow. You are nothing." But the voice was weaker now, and David was here, real, warm. "David!" She barely recognized her own voice. "Yes?" "Why are you kind to me? Why are you helping me?" She hugged the book to her chest. "You don't have to. You're a duke. You have responsibilities in England. Yet you're here, wasting time with—" "With you?" he interrupted, voice sharp but gentle. "Elizabeth, listen to me. Being here is not a waste of time. Being with you is not an obligation." "Then what is it?" Silence. David opened his mouth, closed it, ran a hand through his hair like a man fighting a battle no one else could see. Then he exhaled. "It's a choice I made." Elizabeth forgot to breathe. "I choose to be here," he continued, voice low, raw. "I choose to help you. I choose to watch you come back to life. I choose to see you get angry at every man who made you think you were less than you are." He held her gaze, unguarded in a way that startled her. "And I choose—" He hesitated, as if stepping onto forbidden ground. "I choose to enjoy being near you, to hear you laugh, to watch you realize how strong you are." Her heart hammered, her hands trembled. "David." He was closer now. When had that happened? She didn't know, but she could feel the steady warmth of his breath, the hesitant flicker in his eyes as they fell to her lips and rose again. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. and I will. Tell me to leave, and I'll walk away." He looked at her like he could see straight into her soul. Elizabeth should say it, should step back. Widows didn't do this, decent women didn't do this, but she didn't want to be decent. She wanted to be free. "Don't stop." The words were barely audible, but they were enough. David leaned in slowly, giving her all the time in the world to run, to refuse, to retreat. Time she didn't take. Elizabeth stayed perfectly still, her heartbeat echoing through her chest as he moved closer, inch by careful inch, as if afraid a single sudden gesture would shatter her. When his face hovered a breath away, she inhaled sharply. David pressed his forehead to hers, but this time he didn't stop there. His nose brushed hers, light, tentative, and her whole body trembled. A silent question passed between them, one she finally allowed herself to answer. His hand rose, slow and reverent, cupping her cheek. His thumb grazed her skin as if it was something sacred, and then he kissed her. At first, a soft, hesitant touch, permission more than passion. Then, when she leaned into him, the kiss deepened, calm, gentle, not hunger, not urgency, but surrender, healing. 2 breaths mingling, 2 mouths trembling, not with fear, but with relief. 2 survivors finding for the first time a safe harbor in one another. When he finally drew back only far enough to meet her eyes, he whispered, "Elizabeth, you're trembling." "I'm afraid." "Of me?" "No, of myself." He pulled back just enough to see her clearly. "You don't have to be afraid, not of feeling, not of wanting." "But I don't know how," she admitted, fragile. "I don't know how to do this." David smiled, soft, patient. "Neither do I." He brushed her cheek with the back of his fingers. "But we can learn together." Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into the touch, the first gentle touch she'd felt in years. Something broke inside her, not from pain, from freedom. They stayed like that for a long, quiet moment. Then David slowly stepped back. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice rough. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize." She opened her eyes, steady now. "Please, don't apologize for making me feel alive." He looked stunned. Then slowly, he smiled. "Then I won't." When he took her hand, interlacing their fingers, holding tightly, Elizabeth didn't pull away. For the first time in 9 years, she held back. Chapter 8. The Man Who Was Lost. David was lost, hopelessly, absolutely lost, and the worst part was he knew it. He went back to the hotel that night, still feeling her mouth on his. The kiss, that kiss. Soft and hesitant at first, then deeper when she fisted her hand in his coat and pulled him closer. The way she trembled, not with fear but with something far more dangerous. The way she had whispered, "Please, don't apologize for making me feel alive," when he'd tried to pull away. David poured himself a whiskey and sat by the window, staring out over Boston at night. Snow had fallen all day. Now the city lay quiet, wrapped in white, like her, pure, broken, being born again. He drank slowly, trying to order his thoughts. All he could think about was the faint lavender scent in her hair. The way her wide brown eyes had flown open when he laced his fingers through hers after the kiss. Damn it, he should never have done that, shouldn't have moved that close, shouldn't have touched her, shouldn't have kissed her. Because now he couldn't stop thinking about her. "What are you doing, Carrington?" He could almost hear Geoffrey. "You're stepping into something you can't fix. She's a widow, traumatized, vulnerable. You're a duke with an entire life in England. This doesn't have a future." And Geoffrey would be right. But David couldn't bring himself to care. He'd always had a weakness for the wounded ones, always wanted to protect, to mend, only with Elizabeth. It wasn't about saving. It was about seeing her fight, seeing her grow, seeing her realize she was stronger than any man had ever allowed her to believe. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he'd started feeling something he shouldn't, something dangerous, something that looked very much like love. That kiss had proved it. It hadn't been impulse, it hadn't been an accident, it had been inevitable. And now David had no idea what to do with that. He woke early the next morning, restless. He needed sense, logic, a plan. He needed to understand what all of this meant. The kiss, the feelings, the impossible future that was starting to take shape in his mind. But when he reached the Beacon Hill house at 10 o'clock, and Elizabeth opened the door herself, not Peter's her, every trace of logic vanished. She wore a different dress, still black, but simpler. Her hair was pinned back more loosely. There was colour in her cheeks, at not much but enough to notice, and she smiled. A real smile, full and bright, reaching all the way to her eyes. "Good morning, David." He forgot how to form words. Good morning." She tilted her head, amused, and there was something new there. Confidence, maybe, or lightness. "Are you all right?" "No. I'm lost. I'm in love. I'm completely ruined," he thought. What he said was, "Yes, perfectly well." A lie. And from the look in her eyes, she knew it. They went back to the library, but the air felt different today. Lighter, closer. Elizabeth didn't sit across the desk. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. When she reached for his hand, naturally now without hesitation, David felt something in his chest tighten. She isn't afraid anymore, he realized, not of me, and that was both liberating and terrifying. "This contract here," she said, pointing to a clause with her free hand, "says the profits from the imports should be divided equally between the partners, but Whitfield was taking 70%. "Why?" David forced his attention back to the paper, though all he really wanted was to pull her closer and kiss her again. "Because he assumed you wouldn't read," he said, "and because technically he can argue he's covering operational costs, but—" He tapped another line. "Here it says costs are to be deducted before profits are split, which means he's lying." Elizabeth frowned. "So I can sue him?" David smiled. "You can. But court is slow and expensive. Better approach, renegotiate. Threaten to sue if he refuses a fair division. Men like Whitfield are cowards, they fold." She nodded slowly, thinking. Then, hesitantly, "David, you're leaving soon, aren't you?" The question hit him off guard. He turned to her. "I don't know." She squeezed his hand. "But you must. You have estates, responsibilities. You can't stay in Boston forever." "I can't," the rational part of him agreed. But the irrational part, the part that was utterly lost, wanted to shout, "I can. I'll stay." "I won't leave you alone again," he settled on. "I do have responsibilities, but I also have stewards, agents, lawyers, people who manage things when I'm away." He paused, honest. "But no, I can't deny I'll have to go back to England." Her face fell for a moment, then she forced herself to move on. "So you travel a lot?" "I used to," he said. "Before the title, I spent years in India, Egypt, Greece. Geoffrey said I was restless, that I couldn't stay in one place for long." Elizabeth gave him a small smile. "And now? Now I don't want to go anywhere." "Because you're here," he thought. What he said was, "Now I'm rethinking my priorities." She held his gaze, raw and open. "David, I don't want you to stay just because of me. I don't want to be a burden." "Burden." He turned fully toward her. "Elizabeth, you are not a burden. You never were." "But You are the reason I wake up in a decent mood," he cut in, voice steady. "You're the reason I find myself smiling over dull contracts. You are the reason Boston, which should have been nothing but a brief stop on my way home, has become—" He stopped, realizing he was about to say too much. But she didn't look away. "Has become what?" she whispered. David drew a breath. "Has become the place I want to be." Silence fell, heavy and electric. Then, barely audible, she said, "Yesterday, the kiss." David's heart slammed against his ribs. "Yes?" It wasn't a mistake. She dropped her gaze, nervous. "I wanted you to know that." He lifted her chin gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "It wasn't a mistake for me, either." Elizabeth held her breath. But what if... Her voice shook. What if you go back to England and realize I was only a project, something to fix and then forget? The words hit him like a punch, because a small, cruel part of him had whispered that fear in the dark. Not that he would forget her, that was impossible, but that she might one day believe that was all she'd ever been to him. So he looked into those wide brown eyes, frightened and hopeful all at once, and knew the truth. It wasn't about fixing, it was about loving, damn it. He was in love with her entirely, irreversibly, and he had no idea what to do with that. Elizabeth, he said slowly, you are not a project. You're not something to mend and abandon. You are... He searched for the right words. You are the bravest person I know, and what I feel for you. He swallowed, exposed in a way he hadn't been in years. What I feel is not pity. It isn't duty. Then what is it? She whispered. David took both her hands in his, holding tight. It's love. The words were out before he could stop them, but when he saw her eyes fill with tears, not of pain this time, but of something deeper, he didn't regret them. I'm in love with you, Elizabeth, he said softly. I know it's fast, I know you may not be ready, but I needed you to hear it. She sat frozen, breathing too quickly. Then, very slowly, she whispered, Me too. David stilled. You too. What? I'm in love with you too. The world went quiet. He drew her into his arms and kissed her, not tentative like the first time, but sure, certain. A promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them shaking, he rested his forehead against hers. The next words slipped out before he could think better of them. Come with me. Elizabeth jerked back a little, startled. What? To England. He framed her face with his hands, laid bare before her. I know I have to go back. I know there are duties and estates and things I can't ignore. But Elizabeth... He drew a ragged breath. I don't want to leave without you. Not now. Not when we've just found this. Her eyes widened, stunned. You're asking me to go with you? Yes. He didn't look away. I know it's a lot. I know it's too soon. But... His mouth twisted in something like a smile. England is your country too. You were born there. And maybe it's time to go back. Not as the woman Jonathan dragged across the ocean, but as the woman you are now. She fell silent, thoughts racing behind her eyes. David pressed on, almost desperate. You don't have to decide today. Think about it. Take all the time you need. But know this, I want you there beside me, not out of duty, not out of charity, but because you are... He exhaled, helpless. Because you are my home. Tears slid slowly down her cheeks, and for the first time since Geoffrey's death, David Carrington felt that he had a home too, not a house, not a title. Her. Chapter 9. The Choice. Elizabeth froze. Come with me, to England. The words echoed in her mind like distant bells. David stood before her with a vulnerability she rarely saw in him. Hopeful, afraid, completely exposed. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. He stepped back a little, giving her space, though he didn't release her hands. You don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I know it's a lot. I know it's... Frightening, she whispered, finally finding her voice. Yes. Elizabeth looked down at their hands. His, strong, warm, steady. Hers, pale, trembling, yet holding on. England. The word held weight, memory, pain. 9 years ago she had been torn from Hampshire, sold to a stranger, dragged to Boston like luggage. 9 years without touching English soil, 9 years of exile. And now, someone was offering her a way back, not as a prisoner, but as... What am I to him? As if reading her thoughts, David spoke softly. Elizabeth, I'm not asking you to be a secret mistress, or some sordid arrangement. I'm asking you to come home. To your home. England is yours as much as it is mine. But I have nothing there, she whispered. My father is dead. The estate was sold. There's nothing left. There's you, he said, tightening his grip, and there's the chance to start over, to see rose gardens again, to breathe Hampshire air, to be free. Free. The word struck like lightning. She glanced around the library, the house that had been her cage, the city that had never been hers, the country where Jonathan had buried her alive. Boston was not her home, it never had been. And if I go? She swallowed hard. What if I don't like it? What if it's too hard? Then I bring you back, he said simply. Or we go somewhere else. Italy, maybe. Greece, anywhere you want. And your responsibilities, the dukedom? David smiled, a crooked, honest smile. I told you I have excellent stewards and solicitors. They can manage things while I'm away. And I've learned something, Elizabeth. Responsibilities can wait. But you... His hand rose gently to her cheek. You can't. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of his palm. He loves me. He wants me to come. He isn't ordering me. He's inviting me. Choice. For the first time in 9 years, she had a choice. She opened her eyes. May I think? Just for a little while? David nodded, stepping back but watching her closely. Of course. Take all the time you need. That night, Elizabeth didn't sleep. She sat by her bedroom window, watching the snowfall, weighing the impossible decision. Stay or go. Safety or risk. A familiar prison or an unknown freedom. She thought of Jonathan, of 9 years spent in forced silence, constant fear, existing like a shadow. She thought of her father, the souled marriage, the roses she once tended, the girl she had been before everything collapsed. She thought of David, of the way he looked at her as if she were precious, the way he explained contracts with endless patience, the reverence in his kiss. And then she thought of herself. Who do I want to be? A widow hiding in Boston, terrified of living? Or a woman who plants roses, who laughs, who chooses? By sunrise she knew. At 8 in the morning she walked into the library. David was already there reviewing papers, but he stood as soon as he saw her. Elizabeth? Yes. He blinked. Yes? Yes. I'll go with you. Her voice was steady, startling even to herself. To England. For a heartbeat he didn't move. Then slowly, like dawn breaking, a smile spread across his face. A real one. Full of relief, disbelief, joy. Truly. She laughed nervously, but firmly. Yes. Truly. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into an embrace, warm, strong, overflowing with promise. You won't regret this, he whispered against her hair. I swear. Elizabeth closed her eyes, sinking into the moment, feeling something she hadn't felt in almost a decade. Not just safety, anticipation. The following days were a whirlwind. David arranged everything, passage on a ship, documents, letters to his staff in London, preparing for their arrival. Elizabeth made decisions for the first time in years. She sold 2 of the warehouses Jonathan had left her, David advised, but the choices were hers. She kept 1 and the trade route shares. She hired new solicitors, and she dismissed almost all the servants. Not in cruelty. But because they had been Jonathan's people, his eyes, his ears, never hers, she kept Peter's. He had asked to stay. I'll care for the house, milady, he said softly, and I'll be here, if you choose to return. If, not when, as if he knew she may never come back. She also hired a companion for propriety during the voyage, Mrs. Dawson, an English widow wanting to return home. For appearances, David said with a wink, although between us, appearances are terribly overrated. She laughed, and realized laughing was becoming easy. The night before departure, Elizabeth returned to her bedroom. The room of 9 years, 9 years of quiet tears, 9 years of winter. She opened the drawer. The wedding ring lay inside, cold and gold and dead. She lifted it, held it, stared at it for a long time. Then she walked to the window, opened it to the icy air, and dropped the ring into the snow below. It vanished without a sound. Elizabeth smiled. "Goodbye, Jonathan." She closed the window and left the room without looking back. David was waiting in the hall. "Ready?" Elizabeth looked at the house, the prison, the tomb, the place that was never a home. Then she looked at him, the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had loved her when she thought love was something she didn't deserve. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm ready." He offered his hand. "Then let's go home." And when she placed her hand in his and walked out the door, choosing for the first time in 9 years, Elizabeth felt something she thought had died forever. Freedom. Chapter 10. The Crossing. David would never forget the moment Elizabeth stepped onto the SS Britannia. She paused at the top of the gangplank, looking back, at Boston, at Beacon Hill, at the house that had been her prison for so many years. The sharp March wind tugged at the black shawl around her shoulders. Mrs. Dawson stood beside her, quiet and patient, but Elizabeth didn't move. David climbed a few steps, stopping just below her. "Regretting it?" She looked at him, tears glimmering in her eyes, but something stronger beneath them. "No, just saying goodbye. Goodbye to Boston. To who I was here." She drew a deep breath, turned toward the ship, and descended the gangplank. And when her foot touched the deck, David saw her shoulders loosen, as if some invisible weight had suddenly fallen away. "Welcome aboard," he said with a smile. Elizabeth returned it, tremulous but real. "Thank you." When the ship eased away from the dock, she didn't look back. She simply took his hand and looked forward, toward the ocean, toward England, toward home. The first days felt strange. Elizabeth spent most of her time in the cabin with Mrs. Dawson, reading, resting, getting used to the steady roll of the sea. David visited during the afternoons, bringing tea, books, updates from the captain about weather and course. They talked about everything and nothing, about the sea, about England, about the unknown future waiting for them on the other side. But tension lingered in the air, not discomfort, simply something new. They were together now. Not separated by Boston's cold streets or daily routines, but sharing the same vessel, the same air, the same future. And David could see Elizabeth adjusting, not to him, but to freedom itself. On the third day the seas turned rough. When David reached her cabin that evening, he found Mrs. Dawson exiting pale. "Seasick," the woman murmured, clutching her stomach. "I will rest in my cabin. My apologies." "None needed," David said gently. "Rest. I'll stay with Lady Hadley." She hesitated. Improper, technically. But another wave crashed, tilting the floor, and she nodded quickly. David stepped inside. Elizabeth sat on the narrow bed, holding a cup of tea, her face slightly pale but composed. "Are you sick as well?" She shook her head. "A little dizzy, but I'm all right." He pulled up a chair, keeping a respectful distance. "Do you want me to leave?" "No." The answer came too quickly, surprising them both. She blushed. "I mean, Mrs. Dawson has gone to rest, and I prefer company." David smiled softly. "Then I'll stay." They listened to the waves thrum against the hull. After a long moment, she whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not leaving me alone." David felt something tighten in his chest. "I'll never leave you alone. Not unless you want me to." She met his eyes, vulnerable. "And if I always want you to stay, then I always will." Simple, absolute, true. She set her teacup aside and extended her hand. He took it, threading their fingers together. And they stayed like that, hand in hand. While the ship rocked, the night deepened, and the future drew nearer. On the 5th morning, the sea calmed. David rose before dawn, restless, and climbed to the deck. The air was sharp with salt, the horizon streaked with the first hints of sunrise. "Can't sleep?" He turned. Elizabeth approached with a heavy shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose. She wore it that way now, at least when they were alone. "I could say the same about you." She smiled and moved beside him at the rail. "I dreamed of the ocean. Woke up wanting to see it for real." David watched her, the delicate profile outlined against the soft pink sky, the way she breathed deeply, like every inhale was freedom. Any regrets? She turned, startled. About coming with you? Yes. Elizabeth paused, then slowly shook her head. No, not at all. She looked toward the horizon. For the first time in so long, I feel like I'm going somewhere. Not running. Going. David's chest tightened. To England. To home. She met his gaze. Even if it's not the home I left. He took her hand again, lacing their fingers. It can be better. It can, she whispered, as long as you're there. And so the days fell into a gentle rhythm. In the mornings, David handled business. Geoffrey's contracts, letters from his steward, estate reports. There was much waiting for him in England, but every afternoon belonged to her. They walked the deck. They read together. They talked about India, about Hampshire, about gardens she would plant and journeys they would take. And at night, every evening, David asked her to dine in his cabin. Improper, entirely. Mrs. Dawson, with discreet wisdom, always claimed she was too tired to attend, so they ate alone, and dreamed aloud about what life might be. It was on the 8th night of the voyage that David finally said the words he'd been holding back. They sat by the cabin window, drinking wine as starlight shimmered over the dark sea. Elizabeth looked relaxed, more than he had ever seen her, hair loose, simple gown, her face soft, free of fear, and David couldn't keep the words inside anymore. Elizabeth. Yes? He set his glass down and turned fully toward her. I need to tell you something. Her brow creased with worry. Is something wrong? No, something important. He took a breath. When we reach England, there will be formalities, expectations, and I know you're still in mourning, and that there are legalities to consider. But I need you to know. She leaned in, quiet. To know what? David took her hands in his. That when the time is right, when you are ready, I want to marry you. Silence swallowed the room. Elizabeth froze, eyes wide. What? I want to marry you, he repeated, steady and sure. Not now, not in haste, but when it's right, I want you as my wife. Tears filled her eyes. David, you can't want that. I'm a widow with no important title, a baron's daughter. I can't give you heirs. You're a duke. You need... You, he cut in, firm. I need you. Not titles, not heirs. You. But society... To hell with society. Elizabeth blinked, startled at the language. David laughed, his irreverent, warm laugh that she had come to adore. Sorry, but it's true. I've spent my whole life doing what was expected, being the dutiful nephew, the obedient heir, the polite explorer. But Elizabeth... He squeezed her hands. For the first time, I want to choose what I want. And I want you. She let out a shaky laugh, covering her face as tears spilled. Don't cry, he whispered, brushing the tears away. Unless they're happy tears. They are. She smiled through them. They're happy and terrified. And hopeful. Then let's stay with hopeful. She met his gaze, fragile but brave. But are you sure? About me? More certain than I've ever been about anything in my life. Elizabeth inhaled deeply. Then, in a trembling but firm voice, Then, yes. David went still. Yes? Yes. When everything is in order, when I'm ready, I will marry you. For the second time that month, David had no words. He simply pulled her into his arms and kissed her. Not like a promise, like a certainty. They stayed together long into the night, planning the life ahead, the roses she would plant at Somerton, the journeys they would take, the rules of society they would ignore together. And when Elizabeth returned to her cabin, with Mrs. Dawson politely pretending not to notice her flushed cheeks, David remained at the window, gazing at the sea. He had come to Boston to settle contracts. Instead, he had found everything. Geoffrey's voice echoed faintly in his mind. You can't save everyone. But Elizabeth had never needed saving. She had only needed to be seen. And David, for the first time in his life, understood the difference. Chapter 11. Land in Sight. Elizabeth saw England before she felt it, a thin, dark line on the horizon, rising out of the morning mist like a promise, or a warning. She couldn't decide which. She stood on the deck, watching the coastline slowly come into focus. Beside her, Mrs. Dawson murmured something about Southampton and customs, but Elizabeth barely heard. England. 9 years. 9 years since she had left, sold off, exiled, buried alive in Boston. And now she was returning. But not as the frightened 19-year-old girl Jonathan had dragged across the ocean. Not as the silent, broken wife he had molded. As Elizabeth. Just Elizabeth. And that, she realized, was both terrifying and liberating. Deep thoughts? She turned. David stood behind her wearing a dark coat, hair tousled by the sea wind, that gentle smile lighting his face. Just processing. He stepped beside her at the rail, looking out at the distant shore. Afraid? A little. Of what? She hesitated, then chose honesty. That England will still be the place that rejected me, the place where my father sold me, where no one wanted me. David stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he took her hand. That England still exists. But you aren't that girl anymore. She looked at him. I'm not. No, you're the woman who survived, who chose to return, who's going to plant roses, ignore half the social rules, and make me happy for the rest of my life. He smiled. And if anyone dares to reject you, well, they'll have to deal with me. Her eyes burned. You always know what to say. Not always, but with you. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles. With you the right words come easy. The ship docked in Southampton at noon. Elizabeth walked down the gangway slowly, feeling solid ground beneath her feet for the first time in 12 days. It felt strange, too steady, after so long rocking with the sea. David offered his arm. Mrs. Dawson followed behind them, quiet as ever. The port was a chaos of voices, sailors shouting orders, crates being unloaded, families reuniting or saying goodbye. And Elizabeth, in the middle of it all, inhaled deeply. England. The air was different, colder than Boston, more humid. It smelled of salt, fish, coal, and something else, something familiar. Memory, she realized. It smells like memory. Lady Hadley. She blinked, returning to the present. A formally dressed older man stood before them, bowing with impeccable posture. I am Graves, your Grace's butler. Welcome to England, milady. Elizabeth looked at David, confused. He smiled. I sent a letter telling them we'd arrived today. Graves came from Somerton to fetch us. Us. The word warmed her. Thank you, Mr. Graves, she said, finding her voice. He smiled. Just a small lift of the lips, but genuine. It is an honor, milady. They travelled by carriage. Mrs. Dawson parted ways in Southampton. Her family lived in Brighton, and she was eager to return. Elizabeth thanked her sincerely. The woman had been kind and unobtrusive. Now it was just Elizabeth and David in the carriage, crossing through the English countryside toward Derbyshire. Elizabeth pressed her face to the window, drinking everything in. Rolling green fields, sheep grazing lazily, tiny villages with stone churches, narrow dirt roads framed by living hedges. So different from Boston. So English. And with every mile, something inside her loosened. Beautiful, isn't it? David asked, watching her instead of the scenery. Yes. I'd forgotten. Hampshire is farther south. We could visit if you'd like. She considered. Her father's estate was gone, sold years ago. There was nothing left for her there. But maybe the rose garden was still standing. Maybe there were memories worth revisiting. Maybe someday, she said softly. David nodded, not pushing, and she loved him for that. They stopped at an inn at dusk. David had reserved separate rooms, always mindful of her reputation, even though Elizabeth was beginning not to care quite as much. Widows in England had more freedom, after all. They ate dinner in a private room, lamb stew and warm bread, talking about the last leg of the journey. We'll reach Somerton tomorrow afternoon, David said as he sliced into his bread. The estate is, well, it's large and old and probably needs some repairs, but it has a garden. Elizabeth's head snapped up. A garden? Yes, a bit overgrown. Geoffrey never cared about it. But the structure's there, flower beds, a greenhouse, and— He smiled. Roses, mostly wild ones. But roses. Her heart tightened. Roses. Yes, I thought perhaps you could bring it back to life. Her eyes stung. He hadn't just brought her to England. He had brought her to a garden. David, don't thank me yet, he teased. Wait until you see the place. You might change your mind. But she knew she wouldn't. Because it wasn't about the garden. It was about the promise that she could grow again, that she could bloom. That night, Elizabeth lay in the narrow inn bed, listening to the sounds of the English countryside, an owl calling, wind rustling through trees, the faint stamp of horses in the stable, and for the first time in 9 years she felt at home. Not because she was back in England, but because she was going somewhere she would be wanted. Somewhere she'd be seen. Somewhere she'd be free. She thought of Jonathan, dead and buried in Boston, his ashes abandoned in a cemetery she would never visit again. She thought of her father, dead too, as David had discovered, gone 3 years, alone and penniless. She thought of the girl she had been, frightened, bartered away, silenced, and she whispered into the darkness, I've come back, but I'm not you anymore. I'm stronger now. I'm free. And she fell asleep, smiling. Morning came with a knock on her door. Lady Hadley, David called from the hallway, we can leave whenever you're ready. Elizabeth dressed quickly, pinned her hair, and descended. David was waiting with a small box wrapped neatly in ribbon. What is this? He smiled, handing it to her. Open it. She untied the ribbon. Inside lay a pair of gloves, soft cream leather, beautifully made, and tucked inside them a small card with a single word, written in elegant script, a new beginning. Elizabeth lifted her eyes, emotional. David, for the garden, he said simply. Whenever you're ready. She pressed the gloves to her chest, tears spilling freely. Thank you. No need to thank me. He wiped her tears with his thumb. Just be happy. That's all I want. And as they climbed into the carriage and set off, the final stretch toward Somerton, toward the future, Elizabeth held the gloves in her lap and smiled. A new beginning. Yes, she was ready. Epilogue. Somerton Hall, Derbyshire. 6 months later. Elizabeth woke to the scent of roses, not the artificial sweetness of sachets or candles, but the living perfume drifting in through the open window, fresh, warm, promising spring. She smiled before her eyes even opened. Spring. 6 months since she arrived at Somerton. 6 months since she stepped into the abandoned garden and decided to rebuild it. 6 months since she stopped being merely the widow of Jonathan Hadley and began becoming herself. She rose, slipped on a simple robe, and walked to the window. Below, the garden stretched wide and full, trimmed hedges, clean paths, and at its heart the flowers she now loved more than anything. Roses, damask roses, wild roses, pale blush, soft pink, deep crimson. Some she had brought from nearby nurseries. Others had bloomed from the old dying bushes she rescued with careful pruning and patient hands, just as David had done with her. She touched the windowsill, watching the rising sun paint everything gold. Home. Somerton had become home. Not immediately. At first it had been strange, too large, almost overwhelming. But slowly, room by room, day by day, she had learned to inhabit it, to laugh in its corridors, to drink tea in its library, to walk barefoot through its gardens when no one was looking. And David had become everything. Not her savior, not her owner, her partner. They still weren't married. Elizabeth had observed 4 additional months of mourning, not for Jonathan, but for the conventions she was not yet ready to ignore completely. But mourning had ended. And now? Now the wedding dress hung in her wardrobe, waiting. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, she would marry David in Somerton's small chapel before a handful of guests, the only ones who mattered. And then it would be official. She would be the Duchess of Somerton. But more importantly, she would be his, and he, hers. They were married in the small chapel of Somerton, surrounded by roses and quiet blessings. No grand ball, no swarm of guests, only a few trusted friends, the loyal servants and Graves, who discreetly wiped a tear when David kissed the bride. When they stepped out of the chapel, husband and wife, Duke and Duchess, partners in every sense, rain began to fall in soft silver drops, as if the sky itself offered its blessing. David laughed and pulled her close, shielding her with his coat. But Elizabeth lifted her face to the rain, letting the cool droplets touch her skin, and smiled. "Don't shelter me from this," she whispered. "Let me feel it." Because for the first time in her life, rain was not punishment. It was promise. They were happy. Not perfectly. There were hard days, memories that still ached, scars that would never fully disappear. But they were happy in the only way that mattered, with truth, with choice, with freedom. David kept her safe, not by locking doors, but by opening every one of them and saying, "Choose, always choose." And Elizabeth did. Every day she chose love, she chose life, she chose herself, and she discovered that safety wasn't a fortress or a vow. It was knowing she would never be alone again. 5 years later, Elizabeth was kneeling among the rose bushes when she heard laughter, bright, high, joyous. She turned. A 3-year-old girl, with brown curls and bright blue eyes, ran across the lawn, chased by David, who pretended to be a terrible monster. "Papa, no!" the girl squealed, giggling. "I shall catch you, Lady Charlotte," David growled dramatically. Charlotte shrieked and darted straight into Elizabeth's skirts, hiding behind her. "Mama, save me," Elizabeth laughed, scooping her daughter close. "I'm saving you, see, monster, she's safe in my arms." David stopped, pretending great defeat. "Oh no! Defeated again!" Charlotte beamed triumphantly, and Elizabeth, holding the little girl. The child doctors once told her she would never have, the child who had come despite everything, looked at David. He smiled. That familiar, beloved smile, full of love, full of promise. And Elizabeth knew, with absolute certainty, she was safe. She was home, she was free, forever.